Begin recording. Hello, everybody. Welcome to class today. Today, we're going to talk about Article 2 of the United States Constitution that is all about the executive branch, or what we lovingly refer to as the presidency. My name is Curry Sotner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the Constitution Center. And I'm so lucky to be here today with Tom Donnelly, one of our top scholars at the center. He's going to walk us through the Constitution, the history, and then my favorite part of today's class is asking the big constitutional questions. So Tom, do you want to say hi to everybody before we kick off?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Can't wait to discuss the presidency with you.
So Tom, you know, I always ask you 8 million questions, and the students, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will pepper Tom with them throughout the class. We love questions. And I have a ton of lists of questions. You know, what is the job of the president? What's the power of the president? How has it changed over time? What's in the Constitution? What's tradition? All those pieces. And then we'll end with kind of the big thing that everybody wants to talk about, executive orders. But Tom, the last time we taught this class, there was one big constitutional question that I absolutely loved. And then I wanted to start with this time and start with this framing, and then we'll look through all the components together. And that was, can the president do that? You know I love simple questions. You know I love direct questions. So thinking about when we see an executive order or we see a presidential action or anything about the work of the presidency or the roles, the jobs, the cabinet of the presidency, we can always pause and say, can the president do that? What are some of the behaviors that our students should do when asking themselves this question and trying to solve it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, Curry, and it's something we can use for each of the branches of government. And it really is that question. You take the action of the president, say if it's an executive order telling someone in the executive branch to do something, the question you want to ask is, where is the president getting that source of legal authority? And so part of that is we pick up our Constitution and we look at Article 2 and look at the powers of the presidency and see if the president has any independent source of authority there. But the president can also look to other things like laws passed by Congress, which may give the president some power, maybe some decisions made by courts, which may establish legal precedents for the president to do certain things. And so each time we want to ask, though, that primary question, which is, does the president have the power to do that? And even, Curry, if we find those sources of authority, we want to ask that a second set of questions, which is, are there certain limits in the Constitution that say, even though the president has some authority from one spot, the president still can't do it? It's things like the Bill of Rights and its protection of free speech or religious liberty or other parts of the Constitution that are there to limit the abuses of government.
And I love that. And you're right, it applies to every part of the Constitution. It's my favorite question to ask when we talk about Fourth Amendment and we talk about policing or lawyers or judges or the courts and say, can they do that? So it really does work all over the Constitution, and it leads you directly to the Constitution. So like you said, can the president do that? Look for the power, look for the limits, and look for the necessary partnerships that the president might have to do. So let's start with the Constitution, lay it out for us. Where's the power in the Constitution for the president?
Absolutely. So if we're looking in the Constitution, the powers of the president are in Article 2. So Article 2 of the Constitution tell us about the powers that the president have, what sort of responsibilities the president has. And most importantly, it begins with this phrase, Article 2 vests the, quote, executive power of the United States in a single president. And it's amazing how many law review articles, Supreme Court opinions, political debates turn on those two words you see there in red, executive power, and what that means and what powers are packed into that powerful phrase. But we also see Article 2 giving some details about the presidency. For instance, it sets out the details for how we elect a president, namely through the Electoral College. It sets out how we might remove a president from office, say for abuses of power. So this is that process of impeachment and removal. And then finally, Article 2 also sets up certain core powers and responsibilities of the presidency. Some of these include the president's power as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, the president's power to appoint judges or executive branch officials with the advice and consent of the Senate, president's power to make treaties, provided again that 2/3 of the senators agree in the treaty. This is how the president makes agreements with other nations in the world. It allows the president to speak for the nation with a single voice, subject to that advice and consent function by the Senate. The president has the power to grant pardons to people, so can pardon people for alleged crimes. And then finally, I love that last bullet there, Curry, which is the president has then a duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This is a reminder that Article 2 sets out the executive branch of the government. The president heads that branch, and the duty of the president and of the executive branch is to enforce the laws. And so the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed is a reminder that the law also applies to the president, that no one in the United States is above the law. The president is constrained by the rule of law, and that furthermore, with that responsibility, the president has to carry out and enforce the laws fairly.
Yeah, and I think that's unbelievably important. Like when we talk about this, and we're going to go through, what are the requirements to be a president? What is the normal term of the president, and then gets into the Constitution. It's like you want to go back to what's the job description? What's the power and what's the job description of the presidency? So when you ask the question, can they do that? Then you can look back and say, well, what's their job? Are they doing this as a part of their job? And does that apply? Now, as we look at it, a part of their job is to also check the other branches. So how do they work within that system of the three branches of government?
Yeah, so one key check that the president has of another branch is the presidential veto. So Article 1 grants the legislative branch, Congress, with the power to make our nation's laws. And so when Congress, the US House and the US Senate both pass a bill, it then goes to the president's desk, and the president has then the power to say yes or no. The president can sign that bill, or the president can veto that bill. And often this will be the president's own ability to weigh in on whether or not he thinks that that bill is constitutional. The president has an independent responsibility to look at everything that Congress passes and ask, is this proposed law consistent with the Constitution? And so the president has this veto power. But then the flip side is, again, in this system of checks and balances, that Congress can speak back at the president, that the veto power itself is limited, and that the Congress can override the president's veto, can cancel it with a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. This is a really high bar. Very few presidential vetoes end up overridden, but it's an additional limit on the president's power, and allows for that dialogue and conflict between the president and Congress over the laws of the nation. Another feature of checks and balances here, Curry, and another check on the presidency, is the power of the courts. And so we grant the federal courts, most notably the Supreme Court, the power to review the president's actions, for instance, new executive orders, and decide whether those actions are constitutional or unconstitutional. This is the federal court's power of judicial review.
Awesome. Now, as our students are listening, some of our students, probably like Colin, might want to run for president. I think he might be reserved for the Supreme Court, but just in case Colin wants to run for president, what should he know going into what's the job requirements of the presidency?
There aren't a ton of job requirements. One, though, is there's an age requirement. So you have to be 35 or older. Part of this was designed to ensure that those, people who were either sons or daughters of famous people, they have enough life experience before they aspire to the highest office in the land. So they're not just trading on their own name, but on their own experience and their own reputation in public life. So that 35-year-old requirement was in part designed to do that. The other key requirement is that the person has to be a natural-born citizen of the United States and resident of the United States for 14 years. So there's not a ton of requirements there, but there are a few.
Yeah, it's pretty light and sparse when you look at it. And our youngest president, what's the age of our youngest president? Is it maybe like 40 or 44? That's I can never remember, but
it's in the low 40s.
Yeah. And so and that was, I feel like for a lot of people that Obama was like something like 44 when he was president. And it was and probably JFK was one of the younger ones as well. Oh, thank you. So yeah, very young. So as we kind of go through these things, and we're going to dive into the founding generation and what they thought the role of the president should be and what their worries were. But do you want to talk about the removal process of the president? So what is in the Constitution about saying, something's going wrong here. We need to have a real big check on the president, and that means removing the president from office.
Absolutely. So the president is given a 4-year term. The president can run for re-election, but we also have in place in the Constitution a process for impeachment and removal. And so this process is designed for what if the president abuses office? abuses the president's power in office during the term, what process do we have in place for potentially removing a president? Well, Article 3 establishes the legal standard that's used in this circumstance. It says the president can be removed from office if they're guilty of, quote, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And then we can flip in our Constitution to Article 1 and look at the roles of the House of Representatives and the Senate in this process. The House of Representatives has the power to impeach the president by a majority vote. So this is it's a formal accusation of some sort of charges against the president. And then the Senate has the power to hold impeachment trials, and they remove a president from office with a 2/3 vote. So again, it's this high threshold, Curry, where the founding generation really wanted to make sure there was sort of a broad consensus that the president needed to be removed before removing the president from office. Only 3 presidents have been impeached, and no president has ever been removed by the Senate, although Richard Nixon resigned from office because of Watergate prior to being impeached, and Andrew Johnson came within 1 vote of being removed from office during Reconstruction.
Awesome. And that was a fun conversation in our earlier class about who was that guy. So that's a fun homework assignment for you to figure it out. But let's go back to that founding generation. Article 2, second section of the United States Constitution to write, it's much shorter than Article 1 that deals with the legislative branch. They write it second. Kind of what were their hopes and dreams and worries and fears, dreams and nightmares? That's really what I want to go after here, Tom. What were their dreams for the presidency, and what were their nightmares about the presidency?
Yeah, that's a great question, Curry. And so at the Constitutional Convention, one thing to note about the delegates is that they really worried about abuses of power from all branches of government. So the presidency wasn't unique in that sense. And for them, their greatest worry was actually that Congress was going to be too powerful, that all power would reside in Congress. And so they were constantly looking for ways in which they could check the powers of Congress. Part of that was why they distributed Congress into 2 different bodies, why we have a U.S. House and a U.S. Senate, so dividing power that way. But as they looked to the presidency, part of what they wanted to do was have another branch of government that could serve as an independent check on an overpowerful Congress, a Congress that was abusing its power. But at the convention itself, the framers really, really struggled with how to construct the presidency. They just couldn't find an example of what they were looking for in history or from their own lived experience. So they looked to the kings of Europe and they said, no, that's too much power. That's too much power in an executive. But they looked in their own state governments and their state constitutions and said, these governors are way too weak to govern a great nation. And so they really tried to find some sort of happy balance between some of the powers they found in the kings of Europe, but also some of the limits that they found in the state constitutions in America. And so as we get to the convention, we just see a range of voices and a range of visions as to what the presidency is going to look like. And so we have famous founders like Alexander Hamilton, who was like, maybe something like an elective monarch might work. Maybe the British have a good idea here that the executive needs a lot of power. And so Alexander Hamilton becomes this very important voice for a powerful executive. And after the convention, he would write the most famous essay laying out the framers' vision for the presidency, the Federalist Paper number 78. So I suggest people seeking that out. It's an amazing statement of what the Federalist vision was for this new presidency. On the flip side, we have other voices at the convention saying, no, we don't want a president that's that powerful. We cast off King George III. We got rid of his royal officials and royal governors. We don't suddenly want an all-powerful executive in this new national government. And so a key voice here is Connecticut's Roger Sherman, who of course would broker many key compromises at the convention, including the Great Compromise. But for Sherman, he just wanted the president to, quote, be nothing more than an institution for carrying the will of the legislature into effect. And so this is Sherman having a vision of a really powerful Congress and a very weak presidency. But over time, the delegates really struggled with a range of issues. They went back and forth and back and forth, and sort of noticed that as they're constructing the presidency, it's all of these issues are tightly bound up together. So as they settled on one solution, they then found that it raised an additional problem along a bunch of other dimensions. So their debates were over things like how to elect a president. What's that mechanism going to look like? How long should the president's term be? Should the president be allowed to run for re-election? And again, we've already discussed the impeachment and removal process, but they worry about a president that would get a ton of power and the president abusing that power. So they debated what's the best way to impeach and remove a new president. Should we drill down to, are there any of these in particular you think we should drill down to, Carrie?
I mean, so many pieces, but I know that all the students want to talk a lot about executive orders, but also Fred really does want to understand what the words mean around removal from office. Like, how do we define what those words are, and what does it mean? What's examples of what that means as well? So maybe those two areas we can drill down to quickly.
So I mean, on removal from office, that simply means, what it sounds like. So the process is, in the House of Representatives, there's going to be, a debate over whether to impeach the president. And so with that, it's the House of Representatives considering formal charges against the president. It's a lot like a grand jury in a criminal investigation where the House presents certain charges of abuses of office by the presidency. The Senate then holds something that looks like a trial, and then the Senate has to decide, are they going to remove the president from office or not? And that means, will they basically kick the president out of office and then suddenly have a new president? And we've never gone through and done that through the impeachment and removal process, but that's what's at stake when the Senate holds an impeachment trial.
Yeah, and I think the words where people say, well, what does that really mean? So like treason, you understand what it means. Bribery, you understand what it means. Sometimes that can be tricky too. But high crimes and misdemeanors. Misdemeanors doesn't sound like a big thing to me. I don't know why in my head it seems small.
Well, there's a difference between what we think of today as criminal misdemeanors and what the term meant as a term of art legally around the founding. But I mean, it's meant to be a fairly broad category, and there are debates. You saw it, in recent debates over impeachment, whether or not this should only encompass when the president violates the law, so actually a formal law, or whether it speaks more broadly to abuses of office that may not be technically illegal as to the letter of the law, but speak to really an abuse of office. And so that's one of the great debates you see in impeachment trials themselves, in impeachment proceedings, and in the scholarship around impeachment. And so that's in a lot of ways, the real contested question about the meaning of the impeachment clause.
Awesome. And now I think real quick before we get to executive orders, and because the students really want to understand the history of executive orders, first of all, what they are, the history of executive orders, and then the questions around how do we kind of understand if they are effective, and do they have the power? Does the president have the power for this executive order? Before we do that, maybe we take one beat on electing a president, because that did take, the Constitutional Convention a long time to try to figure out how we were going to get a president after George Washington.
Yeah, and so it's obviously a big topic of debate at the convention. We see the delegates really going back and forth and returning to this question again and again. And there's a range of possibilities on the table as they're debating, how are we going to select a president? For many delegates, the answer seemed fairly simple. It was that we'll just have Congress select the president. If you looked at the state constitutions during the time, most state governors were selected by the state legislatures. And so this was a mechanism that was very familiar to the delegates. And so many delegates advocated for Congress selecting the president. And the convention itself approved that mechanism multiple times during that summer in Philadelphia. So that was one of the things on the table. On the flip side, we had key delegates like Pennsylvania's James Wilson arguing that no, that's not good enough, frankly, because what we need is an executive that is independent of Congress. Part of the reason we're creating the executive branch is that we want a single president that has energy, that can get things done, and that can challenge Congress when it abuses its power. And so because of that, we need the president to be selected by someone other than Congress. If Congress selects the president is then just going to become a tool of Congress. We need an independent presidency. So Wilson actually makes a suggestion of having a national popular vote, that really the American people having a direct say in who the president's going to be. Eventually, the delegates find a compromise between those supporting congressional elections and those like Wilson who wanted popular input in the presidential vote and came up with the Electoral College. So the Electoral College, just briefly, it leaves many of the details of how it's going to be carried out to the states. So it is a system that really privileges federalism, this idea that we're going to have states do different things in different ways. But broadly speaking, the way it works today is that when voters in America go to the polls on election day, they're not voting directly for president, but they're voting for a slate of electors who will in turn vote for president. Those electors are selected in each state by the political parties of the president, of the person running for president. And so effectively what happens is that voters vote for these slate of electors, then those electors meet as an electoral college to cast formal votes for the presidency in December. And then each state receives a number of electoral votes that are equal to the number of representatives that they have in Congress. So that's adding the number of members of the House of Representatives they have with the number of senators. So here you see Pennsylvania, 17 members of the House, 2 senators, so Pennsylvania gets 19 electoral votes. In the end, if a candidate receives a majority of the votes in the Electoral College, they become president, even if they didn't receive, even if they didn't win the popular vote nationwide. And if there's no majority in the Electoral College, then the election goes to the House of Representatives. And so this explains why those who supported congressional election were okay with the Electoral College, because they thought after George Washington, there weren't going to be many people that had the reputation to win a national electoral vote and win a national majority in the Electoral College. So they assumed that many elections for president were going to go to Congress anyway. And then for someone like James Wilson, who supported popular input, he made the prediction that if we place the rules for how we're going to select electors in the hands of state legislatures, the American people themselves would demand a say in who the president's going to be and how those electoral votes are going to be allocated. So over time, the process will become more democratic with more popular input. And in the end, Wilson was right. And frankly, he was right really quickly as states moved towards having popular votes within the states determine the slate of electors for that state.
I love this class because we get to talk about like where in the Constitution it spells out the presidency, what's kind of like the job description. And then we move on to all the issues we hear or the big ideas and big conversations we have around the presidency. One are electing a president, and then the other is about executive orders. So one of our students asked in the question, could you kind of explain the history of executive orders and then kind of how they've changed over time? I thought it was a great question, but let's even stop and like back it up a minute and say, wait, what are executive orders to begin with?
That's great, Curry. And yeah, so executive orders, I mean, the simplest way to describe them is they're a sheet of paper where the president writes out some order and asks someone in the executive branch to do something. So, I mean, they're rooted in this idea that the president, Article 2 sets up the president as the single head of the executive branch. The president is the boss of the executive branch. And executive orders, they vary in length, in complexity, in how much they look like a very simple order versus something that looks like a Supreme Court opinion. Like they really vary quite a bit. But when you really boil it down, it's you see here from the American Bar Association, a signed, written, and published directive of the president. It's the way in which the president is telling other people to do something. This is, again, rooted in the president's role, leading the executive branch, and the president's Article 2 duty to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And so there's no specific, you're not going to find in Article 2 a specific clause that says the executive order clause or something like this, but it flows naturally out of the president's ability to supervise the executive branch. And as to the history of executive orders, Curry, they're there at the very beginning. President Washington uses executive orders, for instance, to do something really simple. He just, he has an executive order that basically just says, cabinet officials, executive branch officials, can you just fill out a report on what you've been working on? So it's like the simplest thing you would expect any boss at a company to do. President Washington uses that to sort of ask for an update on what Treasury Secretary Hamilton, what are you up to? Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, what are you up to? That's one thing executive orders can do, but sometimes they can do really big things too. And so you see the example here of Harry S. Truman using an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. Now, executive orders become such a flashpoint over time for a couple of different reasons. One is that especially from the New Deal onward, there are just way more national laws on the books. The national government's doing a ton more. And so while the Constitution hasn't changed, the president's authority under the national laws passed by Congress has expanded so much by all of these new laws. And so the president sometimes will just be able to issue executive orders under specific powers that they have in the Constitution. But really, most of the time, the president is acting under authority granted to the president by Congress, by laws passed by Congress. And so the debate then over time becomes, is the president actually remaining faithful to what's written in the Constitution and these laws passed by Congress, or is the president using these executive orders to really stretch their powers, or even to go beyond the powers that have been granted to them, with the idea that executive orders, if they're used to abuse power, if they're used to seize too much power, it's the president ordering executive branch officials to do things that the president can't get Congress to pass laws to do. So that's the tenor of the debate, I would say, Curry.
Yeah, and to give like a kind of a great example of it, and sometimes one that has thrown me off in the past, the Steele Seizure case. Because when I said this earlier in class, when I first read this case, I was totally going to go with Truman on this one. I thought it landed squarely I was with Truman on the idea that it's during war, and the war needs to continue to go on to keep the country safe. That feels squarely in the president's power under commander-in-chief to be able to do that. But no, it doesn't fall with him. So tell everybody the story of the executive orders of the Steele Seizure case. And then we have a couple of questions about impeachment that I just want to wrap into the end.
Absolutely. So yeah, the Steele Seizure case, it's 1952. It's during the Korean War. And what's happening is that steel workers are threatening to go on strike. And so in the end, what we know is that if you're trying to fight a war, steel production is really, really important. And so President Truman steps into the breach. He argues that a steel strike is a threat to national security. The Army needs steel to carry out this war. Under Article 2, I am the commander-in-chief. I have to win this war, and that gives me the authority to take certain measures to ensure that our nation remains safe and that our nation can win this conflict. And so squarely under my Article 2, Section 2 commander-in-chief power, I am going to seize these steel mills, and I am going to ensure that steel production continues. And so the president's a really bold statement of the president's power over the military, but also over private property in America during wartime. And so it's sort of like this classic conflict we see in a lot of different contexts between the president asserting authority under the commander-in-chief power, and then the Supreme Court having to figure out, okay, the president has that power, but Congress is also granted considerable power to, for instance, declare war. And so there's often this conflict between which powers go to Congress, which powers go to the presidency, what happens when they conflict, what happens when they speak together. And so the Steele Seizure case gives us a way of analyzing that relationship and analyzing those sorts of issues. And so what does the Supreme Court say? In a 6-3 decision, it says, President Truman, you lose. Sure, many of us may have been appointed by you and by FDR, your political ally, but in a 6-3 vote, we think you get the Constitution wrong. What the majority says is, what you're doing here is you're asserting authority you have under the Constitution, but Congress hasn't approved this move. And because of that, you don't have the authority to issue this executive order to seize the steel mills. You just don't have the authority. In many ways, the most important opinion in the case, though, isn't the majority opinion written by Hugo Black, but it's instead a concurring opinion written by Justice Robert Jackson. And so a concurring opinion is an opinion that a justice writes when they're in the majority, but it could be a really tough constitutional issue. And so the justice says, basically is saying, I have a different way of looking at this issue and how to analyze it. Robert Jackson himself is an amazing voice because he was FDR's Attorney General during World War II. He himself is one of the great opinion writers in the history of the Supreme Court. If you want to treat and just see great legal writing, Robert Jackson is often a great place to look. But what Jackson says is, when we're looking at this question of presidential power, whether it's the Steele Seizure case or really any sort of case, and where we're seeing that it could bring a conflict between the president and Congress, we want to divide the situations into three key categories. The first is that when the president acts with congressional approval, he has the maximum authority to act. That's when presidential power is at its greatest. When he acts in the face of congressional disapproval, he has the least authority to act. That's when the president's power is at its lowest level, as Jackson famously says, at its lowest ebb, very dramatically. And when Congress has neither approved nor disapproved of the president's actions, the president then acts in a quote unquote zone of twilight, again, kind of mysterious and dramatic, but that's somewhere in between those two situations. And what Jackson says in the Steele Seizure case is, hear what Truman's doing. He's acting in a way where I don't see the independent authority in the Constitution itself. Congress hasn't given him this authority, so Truman must lose. But the big idea here, Curry, is that when we're looking to analyze presidential power, the simplest way to look at it is that when the president is acting arm in arm with Congress, the president's power is at its maximum. and the president is most likely to win. And when the president is acting in a way that conflicts with what Congress has said, the president's power is at its lowest level, and the president is most likely to lose.
I love that, and it's such a clean and simple formula for the lower courts to apply. But it's also pretty good, like in general life standard. Like if you work together, you can get the job done. If you work in conflict, you will not. And then there's always gray, which is the zone of twilight, is the world of gray. So really kind of clear around the way. The other thing that I love about this course and this class that we've been talking about today is we talked about how, the Constitutional Convention came back to things over and over again. And that was a rule that they set up in the convention conversation, that they were able to bring up ideas from the past over and over again if they wanted to work out better ideas. And that the president needs to act quickly, but still you need to work out ideas. So it's a good theme throughout today's classes. One of the questions, though, that came from Stephanie that I absolutely love, and it's on this idea of, are they working together? Are there checks and balances, and are their systems working, is around impeachment. If impeachment has never been, a president has never been removed from office, they've been impeached but not removed, is that in a way a telling statement that guardrail is not effectively working? I thought it was a great question. Is that bar too high or too hard to meet? And I kind of wanted to hear from your thought and perspective. What did different sides say on that?
Yeah, so it's a great debate as to whether we needed the scholars debate whether we need to alter both the impeachment side and the removal side, where that and so it's a tough question to say over time, whether it's checked the abuses of the presidency. I mean, it's certainly the case that the threat of impeachment and removal in the face of a broad support for that move helped spur the resignation of President Nixon during the Watergate scandal. And so certainly, although it didn't formally end up going through the impeachment and removal process, certainly people reached the conclusion, including President Nixon, that there was sort of a high enough threshold of support for removal that he was better off resigning than going through the process. So there's that. Furthermore, if you look back at Reconstruction, although Andrew Johnson came within one vote of being removed, there's a lot of evidence that once the impeachment and removal process became really serious and a serious threat, that he tamped down on some of his actions that were undermining congressional reconstruction. And so there's a way in which, even if it doesn't lead to removal, it can alter behavior. But today, I mean, there are sort of two debates about impeachment where you see arguments on both sides. One is that at the impeachment level, is that threshold actually too low? Where it only takes majority support for the House to impeach a president, so that's to bring formal charges against the president. The thought being that as we move towards greater polarization, is it just going to be the case that every president's going to be impeached? Because if there's a president of one party and a House of another party, are we just going to see actually a proliferation of impeachment? And so as a result of that, might we want to raise that threshold a little bit? There's sort of arguments on both sides of that. And the other being that, now with the reality of polarization, is the removal, is the threshold for removal too high because we're never going to have bipartisan support for removing a president? Again, there are arguments on both sides. For the founding generation, they wanted to strike a balance between, if there's a really, really, really bad abuse of power, that there is a method to get rid of that president. But the idea that in the most cases, even if you really oppose what the president's doing, even if you think maybe they're bending some rules, that the normal remedy, the traditional remedy, is still going to be through elections. And so it's very tough to figure out, how do you get those thresholds right, where you really want to be able to remove a truly abusive president, and or be able to chill behavior and make sure the presidents don't, they're afraid of this mechanism, so they don't want to abuse power, without it just becoming something where you're just turning through the process over and over again. It's very, very difficult structural, institutional question.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question, so I wanted to make sure we got it in there at the end. But also, I want to let everybody know that Michael Gerhardt is going to join us this week on Friday at 1:00, and he has been on 2 impeachment trials. So he's really good, a constitutional lawyer, amazing storyteller, but also a primary source on some of the ways that we can define these words and how the courts have defined these words over time, and the conversation in Congress around impeachment. So I think it would be a really great question to bring back to Friday and weave into the conversation. And I will try to make sure, Stephanie, that I ask that again on Friday. So really, really interesting. So thank you all very much. Tom, thank you for all of our questions and making you jumping all over the place. in this class, but it was really helpful and really interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Stop recording. Thank you, everybody. That was great. Stephanie, good question. It's always a good question to ask. Like, wait, have they made the bar too high? We were talking about that, and I was laughing about this the other day. We talked about it with Article 5 and amending the Constitution, because Matt Pinsker last year was like, bar's too high. It's impossible to amend the Constitution.
Yeah.
And he wouldn't sway from it. He really wouldn't sway at all.
Yeah, these institutional questions are always tough. It's tough to get the threshold just right, because you can understand the justifications for why you want it to be a high threshold. It's just hard, especially, and it becomes a moving target based on how norms in politics change over time, because there's no